Palingenesis by Simon Hereward. Book 2, Darkening Tide. Chapter 1, Royal Hunt. The destroyer circled lazily before settling into a tree once more. It was somewhat closer now, on the edge of the clearing, craning its long neck in the semi-dark. The head moved slowly from side to side, while the fiery eyes probed the darkness where Lund lay motionless. The runner sensed rather than saw the eager set of the massive wings still quivering in readiness. His heart was beating rapidly, in time with the pulsing of slow fire where the thorny spears of the brush had raked his body. Though it would certainly have killed him had he not fallen from his perch, Lund perceived that the horror was content for the moment with blocking his escape. It would not have long to wait. Already he could hear the shouts and curses from the keepers cutting their way through the thicket towards him. No doubt they would beat him without mercy when they took him. He winced inwardly at the prospect of more pain, even though it meant escape from being torn by the fangs and claws of the beast. The royal hunt was underway by the time he was flung, bruised but whole, back into his cell. Lund did not take comfort from the fact that he had escaped death yet again, for the despair so apparent in Kor's thoughts still poisoned his mind. He was almost afraid to reach out for the old man. The irresistible beast, commanded by the torque, robbed one of all resolve and hope, though nothing remained but the expectation of violent death. There could be no escape now. Kor was right. Lund struggled to his sitting position, ignoring the ache and burn that covered his entire body like a blanket. He leaned his back against the stony earth and brought up his knees. Dried blood and dirt encased his legs, stiffening the joints. He was overwhelmingly tired. When it came, there was unexpected comfort, a flood of shared experience and simple trust. Often enough, Lund had tried to put the quality of an audible voice to the old man's thoughts. This night, he imagined it with a measure of clarity heretofore absent. Despite the resignation and defeat passed from each to the other, the dark of this fateful night would have been unendurable without access to a kindred mind. They had both seen the destroyer now, in all his malevolent power. Their hopes had finally been dashed beyond revival. Moreover, they had little to communicate apart from saying their farewells. Lund wished fervently that his pitiful expressions could convince the other of the great measure of his gratitude. Soon enough his effort paled. A final flutter stirred his tired mind.
Do not suffer unnecessarily. Run till your strength is gone. Die as well as you can. You have been my hope for many seasons, and it has made my last days bearable. I will watch for you tomorrow one last time.
Lund could find no words to shape into a reply. The taste of sad futility filled his senses till he could choke on it. Ever since the first comforting, reassuring touch of thought 6 cycles before, Kor had preserved his spirit and his sanity. What chance he had for life would depend now as then on the old man's intervention. An image sprang up before him, in spite of the acceptance of his decided gloomy fate, to free the rebellious will that would still strive against and break the bonds that seemed unbreakable. There had been others of his race, watching in the burnt-out clearing, while the beast had barred his way. Had they been there by chance only, or by design? Who had sent them to that exact location? Was there someone beyond the trees aware of their fate? Could it not be that help would come to them on the eve of their annihilation? He dropped down onto the straw, hunger knotting his stomach. The darkness leaned down on him in all its fearful speculation, multiplying his anxiety for the morrow. It would be foolish to search for hope. He sighed heavily and turned onto his right shoulder. A sudden, irritating pressure beneath his ribs, like that of an unshaped stone, made him sit up in exasperation. Angrily, he reached for the object, and was about to toss it away when he felt the cold, smooth texture of worked metal. It was a key, small and crude, obviously made by slaves. Instantly, he recognized it. This key had arrived 2 days before with the boy who had taken his place during his attempted escape. It had freed him from the chain embedded into the stone of the prison wall. Brennick had to have dropped it when they dragged him from the cell. A slight smile formed on his lips, and he thought of Core's message of farewell. Die as well as you can. With this key in his hand, he might find a way to do so. They did not come for him the following day. He was grateful for the respite, though there was still no rations doled out to the imprisoned runners. The royal hunters would have little trouble collecting their trophies. Lund sat in the dark, listening to the rumblings of his stomach, thinking about the hunter he had slain. That rash Torque had not expected strong resistance from a cowed and frightened quarry. He remembered the elation, the drunken joy of destroying such an unassailable warrior, and turned his thoughts to staying alive long enough to taste this heady draught again. If only his strength would not desert him before he had had the chance. The night was miserable and filled with sick anticipation. Would they leave him to starve till the last day? Would the champion runner he had become merely manage to stumble from his cell for a short-lived flight in the scorn of his masters? When the dawn brought tramping guards to his cage door, he almost welcomed the sight of them. He was faint with hunger and had no weapon. The pursuit would be relentless and hard, the hunters eager and determined. Yet his body was sound and keen for a match with the lords of the Torque. The pale, gray-cast sun still touched the horizon when Lund joined the other chosen runners. More than a dozen shapes huddled together in silence, their breath fogging the morning air round their sagging heads. A chain was passed through the links of their ankle manacles and locked into place. The guards growled at them to stay where they were and sauntered over to warm themselves by a smoking fire. Lund felt the familiar ache of anticipation knot his stomach. He folded his arms against the leaf-fall cold. His teeth were clamped together by more than the freshness in the air. Maybe it would be better to die as soon as the opportunity arose. He touched the tiny bulge of the key in his tunic, and wondered whether he should not free himself there and then to die on the spears of the keepers. What did it matter if he took one or two of the oppressors with him? The end would be the same. More slaves were coming from the direction of the cells. As soon as these were chained, the line was moved through an inner gate into the tunnels leading to the easternmost running trails. Lund was not surprised at this. It was the hunting wedge furthest from the near breach in the line. Once more the order came to halt. The slaves crouched down immediately. Some slowly rubbed arms and legs, others merely sat motionless, the sick expectancy washing over them. The keepers moved off, conversing in low tones. Lund marveled at the number of runners to be expended during this hunt. It was a far cry from the 5 or 6 sent out for the 10th day sport he had witnessed thus far. But then the Torque had many slaves to kill. They might as well enjoy the slaughter while it lasted. It seemed, though, that the masters had become very complacent about the possible threat of large numbers of Vran released into the forest at one time. A plan of impossible daring suggested itself to him. He looked around him at the defeated men, wondering how many he could count on as allies. As if in answer, there was a familiar fluttering in his mind. As the meaning became clear, a face appeared before his mind's eye. The face of a young man for whom he had almost perished more than 4 seasons previously.
Our champion still lives.
Brithael. Could it be possible? He glanced in both directions. There were no guards in sight. 3 slaves down, an arm reached from behind the rank of bodies. He grasped the hand quickly and leaned in to risk a whispered communication.
I was told no one leaves the mines alive.
There was a shallow shrug from the other.
The mines are empty, deserted. We are at the end. The breeding pits. We passed through on the way here. Closed down several seasons ago. They will bring everyone from the clearing soon.
Lund stared at him in silence. All the whispers of doom, all the rumored evil tumbled in upon him. There was movement further down the passage. Even more slaves were coming up to join them.
How many will run today? 100?
Brith followed his gaze.
Perhaps more. There are many to slaughter. But tell me, where have you been? I searched for you as soon as I arrived in Grail 2 days ago.
To the line. The place you mentioned. I was almost through, but he came for me, prevented me. The destroyer.
He shuddered with the memory. Guards were approaching from the yard. There was purpose in their step now. A lash whistled through the air. Brith's whispers grew desperate.
They will kill us all today. What will you do?
Lund averted his gaze and made no reply as the words rolled on.
More than 50 perished on the first day. Many after the signal for the end had sounded. There are no more rules.
The slaves rose to their feet. The latest arrivals were linked to the rest.
They took all the youngest ones, the small ones, and released them on the second day. Perhaps 100 or so. They are gone, all of them. Scores of heads for the Torque lords to boast about.
Brith's voice was empty, beyond bitterness, as if he had seen too many similar deeds, and had come to accept them as the natural course of things. Lund felt the initial shock of the tidings course through him. Then he held on to it, treasuring the painful beating of his heart and the taste of bile on his tongue. He pursed his lips slightly. He had seen little of the young runners, yet now he was acutely aware of their kinship. He realized that Luren had to have been among them, and for a moment sensed again the sympathetic presence leaning over him as he had lain crushed and bruised on the floor of his cell. He saw fleetingly the slight smile and wordless meaning in the boy's eyes as he would disappear into the ducts. They had not been related closely enough to communicate in thought, and he had never heard Luren's voice, but their contact had been beyond word or thought, or even the tie of blood. It had been fellowship in suffering, a shared horrible fate. Now he felt that kinship with every branded slave in that cursed world, and he knew that he could not run to escape this day. He would not flee beyond the reach of the overseers and hunters, and abandon children like Luren or Brennick to suffering and death. In the half-dark, he leaned down and fitted the rough key into the lock of his ankle manacle. It opened without protest, the faint click inaudible above the shouting of the keepers. A touch on his shoulder signaled the departure of Brith. He grabbed hold of the hand for an instant and pressed the key into it. A cold metal curve was passed to him in return. The crude talon had been sharpened with painstaking care. 83 runners were shepherded up to the solid bars of the outer gate. Here they awaited the bleak note of the hunting horn that would signal the release of the runners into the trails. Lund cast an eager eye over the slaves. He had to keep them together this day, for their hope did not lie in an attempt to avoid the hunters. If there were to be any resistance offered, it would take a concerted effort. The customary separation of runners into the 5 trails had to be prevented. There was only one man at the gate. He carried a spear and a short stabbing sword in his belt. How careless the Torque had become! It was as if all the Vraan wretches had already perished at their hands. Now that the fate of the slaves was sealed, they posed little threat in the minds of the masters. 3 guards remained with the runners. They were huddled together, their gaze straying back to the fire they had been forced to leave behind. Lund turned his thoughts to Brith.
Release the men next to you. Take the 3 keepers. I will strike down the one at the gate.
A few breathless moments passed. The reply came. He gripped the talon and strode forward. At first the guard only stared at him in puzzlement. Then he opened his mouth to challenge him. Lund launched himself at the hated figure. There was no hesitation. He drove the curved blade through the leather and into the heart. The runners, pressing against the bars, turned to stare at him. Releasing the talon, he slipped the short sword from the stricken man's girdle and sped off, cat-like, towards the struggling group where Brith and 4 others grappled with the guards. It was over before any of the keepers could muster a cry loud enough to raise the alarm. Eager hands dragged the bodies over the wall, then began stripping them of armor, shoes, weapons. Lund raised an arm to quiet the stirring runners. He spoke quickly, the whisper echoing slightly in the tunnel.
We will all die today.
He glanced round the semicircle, taking in the nervous fear.
But now we have a chance to strike a blow. They expect us to be weak and easy prey. These royal hunters are not the best they have, and we will not run this time.
Heads nodded all round in silent agreement. Timidly, fearfully, voices rose round him.
We have no weapons.
What will we do?
Lund felt one of Ceridwen's smiles rise up inside him. This was right. All these slaves were waiting for his thoughts to inspire them, drive them, save them. He would have many arms, many hands this day, with which to strike and deal injury to the enemy. Here was the hour for which he had been born and preserved. His mind was clear and free of doubt at last.
We will remain together. Take what weapons we can from the beaters. Lure the hunters to us and kill them separately. Before we are overcome, the Torque will pay for the heads they've taken, the blood, the pain. We will die without fear. We will die as well as we can.
Among the heavy growth and layered fronds, the morning mist was clearing rapidly. The night damp lingered here and there, a dewy layer on dark leaves, awaiting the first touch of the rising sun. The soft soil lay in pungent, soggy sheets, undisturbed and free of telltale tracks where visible. Bird calls flowered under the canopy, seemingly magnified by the cool air among the gullies and shallow dells. A small antelope moved cautiously and without sound from the deep shade to halt in the center of a faint trail. It sniffed the air, its large ears swiveling from side to side. The small body trembled, a quick heartbeat almost visible beneath the sleek coat. A sound, some distance away, a snapping twig, brought the head and ears around to face up the trail. Swiftly it bounded off into the undergrowth. A few feet away, Lund strained his ears to pick up what the animal had perceived. There was the unmistakable sound of hurrying feet along the faint pathway. Lund's own heartbeat quickened at the sound. Could it be a beater? What else? He peered from the shadows, the muscles of his legs quivering. Kor's warning almost made him jump.
A slave. Stop him.
He signed to the others to remain where they were. Above the footfalls he could now discern the sound of heavy breathing. A small figure came into view, exerting itself to the utmost in a panicky, stumbling run. Lund stared in recognition. He lunged as the boy drew level with him, locking his arm from behind round the heaving chest. There was a sob of fear and a feeble thrashing of the arms to escape his grip. He tightened his hold and spoke urgently.
Brennick, hold still.
The boy struggled to turn his head, not recognizing the voice, but realizing that only a fellow slave could know his name. He calmed down sufficiently for Lund to release him. Fear still etched his features in a depiction of terror, though his eyes now displayed surprise and wonderment. A mask of dried blood stretched from left temple to chin through the dirt he had smeared over his face in an attempt at camouflage. There was a deep gash on his left forearm, and the torn tunic was covered with a dark red stain. Lund could feel the child's heartbeat beneath his fingers, drumming erratically like a frightened bird. He took hold of the healthy arm and pulled the boy after him.
In here.
He could see what effect his whispered words had on the boy, who swallowed hard in an effort to regain his voice.
You did not get away?
Lund shrugged in answer. He checked the pathway for signs of their passing, before retreating back into the shadows. Brennick stared in amazement at the 36 slaves crouching in readiness around them.
What is happening?
Lund reached for the hurt arm in reply. He raised his eyebrows in a question.
The dog. Many of us did not turn at the end of the day. So they sent the dogs after us in the dark.
He winced at Lund's exploring touch, and continued hastily patting the bloodied blade of a talon knife protruding from under his tunic.
I was lucky there was only the one after us.
Lund looked sharply into the suddenly defiant eyes. The boy squatted next to him, his breath still coming quickly.
A runner was killed before I could do anything.
Urine?
Brennick shook his head.
Uren did not run. He went to Kor. I was supposed to go too, but I could not get away. They watched me after they took me from your cell.
Lund raised a hand to silence him. The men around him froze, turning an ear towards the obscure track. Startlingly loud and clear, echoing slightly among the trees, came the call of a beater, soon answered by another some distance away. Kor's thought reached him almost simultaneously.
3 men, coming towards you. Wait for them.
Lund repeated his instructions to the waiting slaves.
Don't get in one another's way. 3 to a man, no more. The rest of you stay hidden.
He nodded at Brennick to include him in the rest.
No crying out. Strike for the throat. Give them no chance for summoning aid.
They had to break the line, break through the advancing beaters without them sounding the alarm. He searched for breath, hiding close by with the remainder of the runners, and paused on the warning. Now all one could do was wait, while the quivering anticipation played havoc with one's senses. Not too soon. The dull metal in his hand was a clumsy implement. The assurance of a moment before threatened to slip away, robbing him of strength. A dark body, crouching in readiness, advanced slowly up the pathway, following the fresh markings Brennick had left in his careless passage. Lund shifted his grip on the sword. A familiar fire consumed his straying thoughts. He was free of hesitation, of uncertainty, of concealment. Striding swiftly, time flowed for him alone, till the parting brush revealed his target, and the touch of death reached with his hand once, twice, before the footfalls of others closed around him. A third man, frozen with fear, the point of his spear trembling, had no chance to reach for the horn. A strangled cry died on his lips.
Quick!
Lund's hissed command sent the slaves back into the undergrowth, clutching their trophies.
A party of hunters. 3 torque with 8 guards and carriers. A mile northeast.
3. Could they be overcome? Lund stared at the furtive movements in the brush, where the untried slaves hurried towards him. Most had no more than 2 cycles on Brennick. Almost none had killed before. He pointed with his bloodied blade.
Northward. Hurry now. If you're afraid, stay out of the way.
He moved with a faithful rhythm born from cycles of running. His thoughts were single, fixed. Purpose flowed from his beating heart to the extremities of his straining body. Below the empty pit of his stomach, strength and cunning directed his pacing legs, till the ease and speed of his passage brought a certain exhilaration. Where he slipped through the thick growth, untold leafy hands brushed his frame, as if to invigorate and bless. Still, there was a touch of fear, though now it no longer stalked him from behind. He was hurrying towards it, eager for the moment of confrontation. Striding without care, sniggering and sneering, came the murderers, their black souls fat, but not yet sated with the suffering of the helpless. On their backs and in their hands were the tools of their violent trade, an array of bows and hunting bolts, double-bladed swords, finely honed daggers for the close work after a kill. There were tears now, unheeded, anguished tears that momentarily blurred his vision, streaking through the dirty mask of his face. His hate became a cry of pain, a voice of unnumbered victims, born simply of a certain blood and people, cursed and condemned in ignorance. And the sun was his witness, the wind, the soil in its wealthy coat of green, the gods in their apathetic silence. Wretchedness would be their part no more. Closing now, closing, form the crooked line, stronger ones to the front, Brith and his men round the flank, brush away the mounting terror. 3 hunters, they were royals, nothing like the mighty one whose blood he had spilled among the leaves.
Cor, stay with me.
There they were, a straggling line of men, the reek of their arrogant malice like an ensign over their heads. He heard their laughter, even a cry of exultation.
Look! What sort of hunt is this? The prey has come to us.
Among the guards there were surprise and consternation at the appearance of such large numbers of prey. One had enough sense to send the blast from his hunting horn echoing through the trees, the sighting call. Before the slaves closed in on them, an answering call had come from the line of beaters to the south. The hunters launched their missile almost simultaneously. Of the 3, 2 found their mark. The third passed between Lund and the next striding runner to splinter a sapling with its broad, cruel tip. The stricken runner stumbled and fell. It mattered little. There would not be time to reload. Lund singled out the largest of the torque and surged forward. Fear was forgotten. Now the madness was taking him. He would not struggle against it. There was no longer any reason to be cautious. He ducked under the sweeping blow of the other sword with ease and struck with all his strength. The tip of his blade dented the chest armor of the torque with a resounding clang but did not penetrate. His enemy staggered backwards from the impact, scattering the guards behind him. A hunter's sword touched the rounding of his bare shoulder, drawing blood. Another raked across his back, surely a painful cut, though he felt nothing of it. Everyone was screaming. A wounded runner on the ground, the hunter now steadied by his guards, preparing his counterattack. The fearful slaves closing in on unassailable oppressors, waving their spears with the ineffectual lunging induced by panic. Close by came the snarling of a savage, drowned out by the anguished wail of the torque, whose hand he had just severed in a single swift strike. He transferred the short sword to his left hand and shook the excellent sword free from the severed grip before he realized bemusedly that the snarling was coming from his own mouth. Brith fought the paralyzing fear that sapped away his resolve. He glanced at the spear he had taken earlier, as if to draw courage from its closeness and solidity. Had he not taken the life of its former master? Why would he hesitate now from striking against others like him? Could the mere sight of the dreaded torque reduce him to a sniveling wretch? He glanced around at the other runners, their eyes a mirror of his fear. The torque and their guards stood encircled, at bay, yet if they were not quickly overcome, help would surely arrive. Among them, alone, stood the resolute form of Lund, a hunter reeling away from him, clutching the stump of his right arm. The youth seemed unaware of his peril, lost in the rage Brith had sensed in him before, preparing for the simultaneous assault from the other two hunters. Still, Brith hesitated, cursing himself for his cowardice. The guards opposite him spat jeering insults to the slaves, laughing every time they retreated before a feigned attack or the mere brandishing of a weapon. They well knew the runners were afraid of them. As the hunters attacked Lund, the largest from the front, the other from the flank, all Brith could do was to watch in horror the unequal struggle he knew would follow. There was a stirring among the slaves as a small form detached itself from the hesitating group and rushed forward to where Lund stood alone against the overwhelming assault. It was a boy, Brith knew by sight, a stripling child, waving a crooked blade, rushing to what could only be his death. The sight tore at him, till at last he forgot himself and hurried forward to join this demonstration of impossible courage, not waiting to see if anyone would follow. Lund grinned wildly at his approaching demise. Elation flowed through him. He would die in defiance and not fear, facing the hunters instead of running from them. This had ever been his dream. He managed to parry the initial furious blows, whirling away to his right, and strike a counterblow to the side of the big man's body. It was gratifying to hear a gasp of dismay. Had he not been the one to laugh at the appearing of the slaves but moments before? It would be worth striking him down, even if that meant he would expose himself to the other. A wild lunge gave him the opportunity. He parried with the short sword, and swiftly forced the torque blade along the arm of his opponent to penetrate the relatively weak armor at the armpit. It was a death blow. The stricken man wheeled away, his sword slipping from his useless fingers, carrying Lund's weapon with him. There was but a moment to savor the victory before the other hunter's blow would fall, and not sufficient time to lift the shorter blade to defend himself against it. Smile, he thought, at your death. Ceridwen's smile. A sudden press of bodies swirled round him, intruding, distracting. The screaming was closer, more urgent. Fighting forms invaded his final reflections so deliberately that when the blow came, it went well wide of the mark. Yet the hunter recovered quickly, shaking off his new assailant. He aimed a blow at the prostrate form that never had occasion to fall. Lund's blade entered the eye slit in his helm, severing life and intention from his poised arm. They crashed to the ground, still locked in the lethal embrace. Lund rolled away from the quivering body and snatched up the fallen weapon to join the bloody work all around him. The guards were desperate now that their all-powerful masters had been crushed. Led by the one-handed Torque, they rushed the ring of slaves to attempt to break out. The press of runners yielded a little before their onrush, then held as the darting figure of their champion fell on the flank of the guards, hacking and hewing like a fiend. The slaves pressed forward, preventing their escape, dragging them down for the death blow. A shout of triumph issued from many throats as the last one collapsed. The remaining men, 3 lightly armed carriers, were overwhelmed in little time, the last of them dispatched while begging for mercy. A sudden quiet descended on their small scene of carnage, only disturbed by the groans of several wounded runners. The bodies of their oppressors lay in a tight circle, battered and maimed. In the midst of it stood Lund, still wearing the smile he had prepared for death.
The dead beaters have been discovered. They are angered. They wait for reinforcements. If you have the strength and intend to die today, they linger but a mile away. 28 men, 45 more closing in.
Lund looked at the runners around him. 3 lay unmoving among the leaves. At least a dozen more were severely wounded and would not be able to participate in another fight. Their lack of armor, weapons, and fighting experience had made them vulnerable. All the slaves seemed exhilarated with their achievement, looking at one another in wonderment, but he could sense that they were drained and fatigued now that the urgent excitement of the skirmish was over. They had neither the skill nor the strength for another head-on confrontation. If he intended to die this day, did he? Lund knew instinctively that another confrontation would probably finish them all. The lack of sustenance and heavy action had drained him also. Now he wanted to live for another day of vengeance. He turned his mind back to Kor.
Could we outdistance them?
You intend to wait for the night?
Their beaters are almost blind in the dark.
There was a moment's hesitation before Kor replied.
There are 5 hunting parties to the west of you, and 4 more to the south. Head due east and turn southeast when I tell you.
Birth came over, carrying 2 sets of hardened leather armor he had taken from the dead guards. They would leave the heavier metal armor of the Torque behind, for it would certainly inhibit their running. In silence, he strapped one round Lund's torso, then stood to be garbed in turn. It felt strange to wear the stiff and cumbersome protection of their enemies. As he caught Brith's eye, Lund felt the stretching of his lips into the now accustomed smile. They split the group in 2, sending the exhausted, the very young, the wounded with Brith, while the stronger ones would accompany Lund. These latter would leave a trail easy to follow, but move much quicker to stay ahead of the hunters till nightfall. The groups would rejoin as soon as the pursuit ceased. Lund raised an eyebrow when he spotted Brennick among the runners of his group. The boy looked him straight in the eye and merely said,
I'm with you now.
Sure you can keep up?
Brith spoke out in support.
He has the heart for it. If he had not gone for that hunter when we all stood hesitating, we might still be struggling with them. As for you,
He shrugged.
who knows?
Lund put his free hand on the boy's shoulder.
Don't lose sight of me.
He raised his head to look at the other runners. About 40 would take the dangerous route with him. He nodded briefly at them and strode away towards the east. In 2s and 3s they set off after him, carrying with them the spoils of their victory, spears, swords, and 3 heavy hunting crossbows. The silence was complete. Long shadows stretched among the trees, whose rough columns divided the gold and gloom of the twilit forest. Not a leaf stirred in the breathless air. The fluttering and raucous movements of the birds had ceased altogether. Alone among the fronds, hidden in a ferny clump, a slight form stirred. Slowly, painstakingly, the green curtain parted an inch. A single eye peered out, this way and that.
I tell you, there is no one out there.
The lookout spoke in a barely audible whisper behind his cupped hand. Lund shifted his weight to ease his cramping legs. Of course, the runner was right. If the hunters were close, they would have heard as well as seen them. Yet he remained uncertain, simply because he did not have the familiar assurance from Kor that all was well. Ever since Lund had run in the trails, Kor had been more than his own eyes and ears could be. The sudden silence from the old man was more than disturbing. Why had he failed? Was he simply exhausted and needed his rest? He had never seemed to before. But then Kor had been feebler and more despondent since the uprising. Perhaps he did not have the strength any more to linger for a whole day so far from his body. He strained his ears again. Did he not hear the sound of the dogs? There, on the verge of perception. He touched the lookout with a finger.
Stay here, till Brith and the others come in.
The soft curtain of ferns behind them parted, revealing a frowning face. Lund nodded the newcomer away and crept after his retreating form, assuring himself that all was well. The runners waited for him in a thicket of ferns, so well concealed that not even the piercing eyes of the Torque could have picked them out. No, if the dogs were not employed, there would be safety in this place for the night. Brith and his limping band arrived only once the sun had set. He had come to the end of his endurance, both physically and mentally, and was immensely relieved to see the runner stepping out of the ferns in front of him. A feeling of the deepest foreboding had cloaked him since he and Lund had parted earlier, and only now, in the sight of the beckoning friendly arm, did it seem to ease. He did not want to die, not as some defiant slave hero in a forest filled with hate and menace, not at the hands of the beasts that hunted them. Yet now there seemed no way to avoid it. His day had come, even as it had been postponed when he had first encountered the strange young runner whose thought he could perceive, who now waited for him somewhere in this thicket. The heavy breathing behind him gradually lessened as he wound his way deeper into the growth. He was ragingly thirsty and weak with hunger. What would happen on the morrow he would rather not consider. The dreary prospect of a cold and empty night loomed between. Oddly reluctant to disturb the other's thoughts, Brith searched among the huddling groups. Low voices reached from this side and that, as the rustling of dry leaves in a gentle night breeze. The condemned, he thought, the hopeless, marked for violent death, clinging to one another in their fear. A hand on his wrist made him start. It was the boy of earlier.
This way.
He was led away further into the thicket, to where a dozen shapes pored over a drawing in the sand. The ferns were stunted and sparse here, allowing the light from the twin star to illuminate what they were looking at. Lund rose at his approach and extended an arm. His movements were slow and peculiar, almost graceful, as if the day's dreadful business had not affected him at all. Something had changed in him. Brith was convinced of that.
I am gladdened to see you here safely.
The other heads had turned to look at him also. The boy released Brith's arm and stooped down to retrieve something from the ground. It was a leather skin he recognized as a quiver they had taken from the torque. Instead of bolts, it now contained water. He took the proffered bag gratefully. Lund spoke again once he had drunk his fill.
Join us. We are discussing the plan for tomorrow.
His eyes caught the starlight, gleaming oddly. Plan? Brith wondered what possible plan could be formulated against the certain death stalking them, but did not reply. He kept out of the deliberation that followed, yet looked on with keen interest. The runners had 3 bows, sufficient other weapons for 20, 2 nets, and rope for setting traps. It was agreed that the torque would not be foolish enough to hunt them in the old way on the morrow. Yet no one could divine in what fashion they would adapt their method. Certainly they would move in larger groups, well guarded against attack. Would the beaters still be employed? How else would they flush out their quarry? Lund outlined a simple tactic to lure a number of hunters into a prepared killing ground. He and 2 others would act as bait, fleeing in apparent panic as soon as sighted. Whoever followed would rush into the prepared clearing, be distracted by the traps, and ambushed by the armed runners waiting for them. Heads nodded all round at this.
We need 30 runners at the most able, the swiftest, for we need to disappear from the scene as quickly as possible, as well as shake off possible pursuers.
He looked directly at Brith.
The rest will head away from the threat, southeastward, maybe as far as the line.
All the eyes now glistened in his direction.
Would you keep them out of the way?
As enticing as this request was to his cautious mind, Brith was suddenly reluctant to agree to it. He wanted to convey something of the apprehension he had felt during the long day of slow-paced flight, the terrible vulnerability of his enfeebled group, the increasingly strong suggestion to abandon the struggling slaves and give himself over to panicked flight. Yet he was already offered the easier, safer part, and expressing any of these misgivings would make him out to be the most miserable of cowards. He remembered the little boy rushing to Lund's aid while he had hung back during the battle with the hunters, and despised himself. His whispered reply betrayed nothing of what swirled about inside him.
Of course.
The heads turned away. Only Lund held his gaze. A quick thought pulsed in his head.
Thank you.
The talk turned to provisions. Rations taken from the hunting party had given each one little more than a mouthful. The hard work during the day had sapped their energies even further. An older man, perhaps a survivor from the fighting pits, spoke for them all.
We need to find food of some sort, or all our plans are worthless.
Other voices joined in.
There is little opportunity to trap or hunt.
The season is late for berries.
We should make our next camp near Yina shrubs. The roots are bitter, but you can eat them just like that.
Lund held up his hand and turned to Brennick.
How many dogs did you kill?
Just the one.
And what did you do with it?
We ate it.
A collective sigh rose from the huddled runners.
What I wouldn't give.
Pity they didn't send them out again today.
Nobody noticed the shudder passing through Brennick's body, or the quick exchange of looks between Lund and Prith. Hunting dogs were not easy pickings. Killing an isolated animal was good fortune, but hardly to be expected. The dogs of Grail hunted in packs of a dozen or more. Lund rose, signaling the end of their meeting.
Fill your belly with water. Find a good place to sleep. We'll move before first light.
He turned and slipped away through the brush. Prith remained with 3 others, sitting in dissatisfied silence. He needed to find out where the water source was, for he could not hear a stream anywhere. He was about to ask when the man who had mentioned food before spoke up.
Roots and berries.
He shook his head.
What we need is meat, like the dog that boy had.
Prith shrugged.
Even if we were close, that carcass would be stripped clean by now.
Glassy eyes turned towards him.
To think what we left behind today.
Prith was mystified.
What?
The man whispered his reply.
There are other bodies also.
Swift suspicion settled in his mind.
You don't mean...
The other spoke vehemently.
We could survive with enough food.
Prith felt the chills creeping up his spine.
You will become like them?
Behind them a toneless voice rose, loud and clear, to scatter at once their whispered conversation.
I will kill the one who touches the dead body.
Lund stepped through the screen of foliage to stare dispassionately at each in turn.
We are not to survive in the end. We are to die as well as we can.
It seemed impossible to find sleep. Prith sat up in exasperation. A shiver passed through his frame, rattling his teeth. The discomfort of a forest bed he could abide without complaint, but the cold of the rhyme-song night, combined with the ache of his empty stomach, made poor companions indeed. Would the dawn find him worse off than the eventide had? He rubbed his bare arms and legs in the vain hope of warming himself. Perhaps another drink of water would do something for the cramps in his belly. A pool, mossy and shallow, supplied the runners with the only sustenance available. As he made his way towards it, Prith could hear rustlings and stirrings all around him. Many others had trouble sleeping this night, and small wonder. Someone was sitting by the pool when he arrived, back propped up against a tree, apparently asleep. He shook his head enviously at the form and knelt down to drink. The twin star was directly overhead, staring at him from the reflection of the pool. A field of stars spread away from it in every direction. He touched the surface of the water with his finger. The sky danced in quick undulations till all was light and fiery motion. A voice broke through his reverie, startling and close. His heart skipped a beat. He pulled back his hand as from something poisonous.
They pass by me in the dark. I can feel them escaping the world.
It was Lund. The sleeping figure was Lund. Prith let out his breath, trying to comprehend what he had just heard.
Who?
The ones I killed today.
There it was again, the strange feeling he had picked up earlier that day. He peered at the sitting form.
What?
6. They passed by, and I let them leave. Where do you think they go?
Prith did not move. His thirst suddenly forgotten, he shivered with more than the cold. Was Lund losing his mind? Now that all avenues were blocked, and hope was a worthless traitor, had his reason also slipped away? The voice droned on, calm like the water before he had disturbed it.
I think they go back to where they were, you know, before they came here, to this place. They are someone's hands, reaching out to do his bidding. His will brought them here, and now they return to him. Whether in disgrace or triumph, I know not.
You speak mysteriously.
You think my speech mysterious? What is more mysterious is who he is, whose thoughts they are, and what he wants with such as them.
He paused, raising his eyes to the stars.
And whose hands are we, you and I? And what are we to do?
Birth did not reply. What were they to do? Did it matter? When the sun rose, they would die and return to the dirt. There was nothing for them to do. Lund rarely dreamed. The discomfort of this night kept him close to the surface of wakefulness, struggling in and out of fearful situations. Only just before the stars started to fade did he slip into the well of deep sleep, where phantasms shaped themselves into fixed impressions. He was in the rinsing vat, a boy with tired limbs and hanging head, waiting for the sting of the lash on his back. Around him pressed the keen threat of nameless monsters, all intent on his hurt, the breaking of his mind and body. Fear was a living thing inside him, irresistible, irrepressible, omnipotent. Something touched his mind, a brush of illumination, almost imperceptible. At first he thought it had to be Kor, but even in this state of mystification, he reasoned that Kor had only come afterwards, once he had arrived in Grail. The overseers noticed it too. Their movements became furtive, uncertain. Their snarling subsided altogether. Then there was expectation, of such potency that it was difficult to breathe. Outside, in the tanning yard, something was happening. A golden radiance descended from the sky, flooding every dark corner of the hut. The monsters darted about chaotically. Some tried to shield their eyes. Others dropped to their knees, wailing. Slowly, he clambered out of the vat, lured by the brightness outside. Wings unfolded out of the fire, casting feathered shadows over the dreary yard. He was alone now, staring at the wonder, all the fear forgotten. Here was all for which he had longed and prayed. Here was deliverance, hanging in the sky, between the great wings, not a bird but a man. There was a touch on his shoulder. It was the boy, Brennick. His face was creased with concern. His hands cupped a number of sizable blackberries. Lund sat up, brushing the back of his hand over his face, and discovered why the boy stared at him so. The dream had brought unheeded tears to his eyes, the traces of which were still all too visible. He looked down at the proffered fruit and shook his head slowly.
Eat it yourself. You need the strength.
Brennick shrugged.
I will not live long if you should fail.
I'll take half of them then.
They ate in silence, finishing the scant meal all too soon. The light from the approaching sun infused the sky with the first hues of early morning. They rose together. Lund reached out to touch with light fingers the long cut running along the left side of the boy's face. There was no flinching nor sign of distress. He remembered what Bruth had said the night before.
You are a brave boy.
Large eyes looked up at him.
I am afraid, but not so much when I am with you.
Stay with Bruth today. You may live a little longer.
He raised his hand to stifle a certain protest.
It will be very hard. We will move quickly and often. It will be too much for you.
The boy did not argue. He was sensible enough to realize the truth of what had been said. Instead, he pursed his lips and looked away, blinking rapidly. Before turning to trot off, he looked up again and made a quick, breathless request.
Don't die without me.
The plans were made, such as they were. Lund knew that it mattered little in the end, but it felt much better to have some strategy than to await the inevitable cowering in a hole. How he would miss Kor today. The memory of the old man was more a longing than an appeal sent into the silent sky, as if his protector could unfold himself from fiery dreams and descend in irresistible power on mighty wings. Yet he felt an immediate response to his probing, and there, as always, like a touch to warm his chilled body, and a charm against his morbid thoughts, streamed the comforting assurance of a kindred mind.
Core, you wore yourself out.
I am failing. I had traded much of my remaining time during the uprising. What little help I can give you, though, I will.
Lund could sense the other's attempt at hiding his distress. Perhaps it was more than his diminished strength, his fading essence. Perhaps he had no desire to witness the destruction of what had been his last hope. A sudden fear gripped his heart.
Core, I want you to be there when I die.
Lund struggled to formulate the thought.
Could you help me to pass through the gate? Just...
Core's reply came abruptly, brushing aside his question almost dispassionately, though he felt an echo of his own fears in it.
I cannot aid you in going where I have not been. But if you die today, I will not be long in joining you wherever you have gone.
It was a different kind of terror, he realized, than the paralyzing panic his wild flight before pursuers had previously inspired. There was almost an element of excitement now, holding back sufficiently for the hunters not to lose sight, leaving a trail easy to follow in case they did, feigning weakness and fatigue. It was a game with high stakes, but one he knew he could not keep up. Sooner or later the strength would drain from his legs, and if he were to play again the next day, he had to be far away by then, out of reach. 4 hunters, screened by at least 20 guards, kept pace with them, all the while sounding their horns to bring in more. This sudden tendency to share their quarry was a source of grim amusement to the runners, even as the cautious approach frustrated the latter's attempt to lure the Torque into the trap set for them. Lund knew that the killing of the hunters would have to be done quickly. The hesitations of the previous day could cost them dearly now that the hunters were on their guard. He signaled the other runners, and they halted briefly in a thicket. Peering out at their pursuers, they exchanged comments laced with annoyance.
Look at them.
They're actually scared.
The heavily armored hunters halted now that they had lost sight of the quarry. Bolts were latched, while the guards fanned out in a semicircle in front of them. There was another blast from the hunting horns before they commenced the cautious advance. One loosed a wayward bolt in the direction of the hidden runners.
They hunt like cowards. All chance and no risk.
Lund grinned to himself that he would live to see a day runners complained about the lack of aggression on the side of hunters. Still, these cowards would not be surprised easily. A silent call broke through his contemplations.
Land, we are discovered. Beaters sounding the sight.
He waited for more, beckoning the 2 slaves with him to follow. Brith could not be too far away from them. It was early still. He slipped through the forest at a steady pace now, concern growing in his mind, the hunters behind him forgotten. When Brith's thoughts reached him again, they were confused, tainted with panic.
Hunters! A dozen, no, more. What should I do? Where are you?
Lund quickened his pace. He nodded to one of his companions.
Fetch the others.
He pointed to the northeast.
Make for the line, as fast as you can.
Then he turned his mind to find Brith.
I am coming up towards you. Go east towards the line. Try to bring them round towards me. Core, how far?
2 miles. Keep your head in. You will have to wait for the rest.
Wait! How could he linger when the wounded and weak were exposed to the butchers? 2 miles. It would not be long. Ignore the knowing weakness. Slip through the brush. Keep your mind on the rhythm of your body. But it was no easy task to do that, for the bewildered cries from the scene of horror ahead found their way to him, and he would not shut them out.
The slow ones are taken. They are everywhere. We are cut off.
He could hear the eager braying of the hunting horns now, just ahead of him. Curse the vulturine Torque, forever preying on the defenseless, the weak, keeping themselves out of harm's way. If he could only reach them in time. Breath was faltering. His thoughts lost their urgency, growing more and more resigned.
I will turn back, or all will be taken. We cannot escape like this.
The fool would not last an instant against so many. Lund strained ahead, willing the other to remain on course.
Hold on! Bring them to me!
It was futile to turn back. They would break him.
I die first. Don't let them take my head.
Lund poured all his desperation into his thought.
Leave them! I cannot lose you!
Was this how Kor had tried in vain to persuade him in the past? Had he been as ready to throw away his life in a hopeless attempt to shelter others? Brith would have to be convinced.
Let them scatter in different directions, and do the best they can. There is nothing you can do now.
He almost felt the other's anguish in his reply.
Fare you well.
Brith closed his eyes for a moment. Once he had made the decision to halt, a measure of calm had settled over him. The wild drumming of his heart pounded in his ears. Around him rang the sounds of death, bodies breaking through the growth, crashing to the ground, the screams of mortal terror, the triumphant shouting of the predators. He had known this would happen. He had felt it the day before. There could be no way to evade the hunters, no way to defend the weak. The spear he carried suddenly became a foreign object, challenging his primitive skill, as if he had no right or power to wield it. Gradually, his breathing became less labored, and the dryness in his mouth abated. He swallowed forcibly, as though to gulp down his fear. Gripping the weapon with both hands, he opened his eyes to find an enemy. Someone stood at his elbow. It was Brennick, his eyes wild and staring, his breath racing. From his good hand sprouted the crooked claw with which he had killed the hunting dog. It seemed small and insignificant, even in the hand of a young boy. The shout turned their heads to the right. 3-4 beaters burst through a wedge of brush between tall trees. They leveled their spears. One lifted a horn. 3 quick blasts followed to join the mayhem of noisy slaughter. A sighting call. It had sounded for him. The sharp blades of the spears leered at him, at his fear, his impotence. They would pierce his flesh, steal away his life. Next to him, Brennick stirred, readying himself for the rush, a juvenile wild cat, to perish in the iron jaws he could not overcome. The blood went to his head. There was a long, drawn-out scream, high-pitched and feral. The spears turned to face him, fend off his thrust, skewer him. A blade lodged in his chest, biting into the leather, but he twisted free, slipped inside their reach, struck again. At last the screaming stopped. Brith crouched over the body of a man, panting for breath. The 2 remaining beaters were backing away quickly, the squealing of their horns thin and fearful. The boy had closed up with him and was tugging at the grip of a long knife lodged in the dead beater's belt. When it came free, he tucked the talon inside his tunic and looked up. His eyes widened. Brith followed his stare and froze. 20 yards away, 3 hunters stood, their bows at the ready. Several guards appeared behind them. More men, beaters, emerged to their right to block their way of escape. One of the hunters, nervous or overeager, loosed a shaft at them. The aim was poor, and the bolt struck the body in front of them, sickeningly lodging in the flesh of the bare thigh. As the Torque lowered his weapon to reload, a body plummeted from among the trees, like a stone cast among unsuspecting birds. Lund could hardly believe his good fortune. The hunters were armed with bows, but stood facing away from him as he came upon them, their attention fixed on some hapless slave. A flock of guards to their rear did not notice him or give warning until it was too late. He was among them, thrusting and hewing, enjoying their frantic clumsiness, their shock and sudden near paralysis. With ease that later reminded him of the cotton picking in the farm clearing, he parried their ill-aimed weak attacks and countered with force till the sword grew heavy and he wished for a shorter, lighter blade. They scattered the cowardly guards before his onslaught, leaving the hunters on the ground, bleeding out their lives. But he would not let any of them escape, and dragged them down, one after the other, till he could no longer lift his arm. There were others now, with him. One was the strong runner who had kept up during his mad rush. Then there was Brith, and the boy, still alive. He had been in time. The beaters, sensing his utter fatigue, remained within sight, bunching together uncertainly. When no more runners appeared, they took up the call again. 4 Vron slaves, though proven dangerous, were obliging the slow-moving hunters. Lund straightened up, hating them, the carrion crows, forever feeding off the misery of others. They were no threat without the masters behind them. He watched their tentative advance, their bulging eyes, spears extended towards him, as if he were an unpredictable animal that might charge without warning. Answering calls came now from the north and west, hunters' horns from the slaughter of the feeble, insatiable, eager for more. Lund knew he had to flee. There was nothing more to do but retreat, and yet he was loath to let the filthy Torque take the heads of the fallen as trophies to boast about in cycles to come. The hunter bellowed like an angered bull, clutching at the shaft protruding from his chest. Between his frantic fingers ran the dark blood. The two with him loosed their bolts at nothing, and fell over each other to retreat beyond the reach of this invisible assailant. Guards moved forward reluctantly, interposing their armored bodies between their masters and the threat. The 4 runners huddling together just ahead did not move. They were clearly at bay and worn out, yet it would not be wise to come within their reach. The dead bodies strewn about them testified of what would occur if they were underestimated. And now an unknown marksman had laid low another hunter. A blood-curdling yell rose from a dense patch of growth on their flank. The men spun round, wavering. Armed slaves poured out, screaming like demons, brandishing an assortment of captured weapons. The 4 just ahead joined the attack, vying with one another to reach them first. The guards broke. Most tossed away their weapons and fled in panic. A few offered token resistance, but when they saw their masters hard on the heels of the running mob, they joined the rest in their attempted escape. Soon the death cries of the beaters and guards rang through the forest, adding to the panic and consternation of those still arriving in response to the sighting call. Fear infected the boldest of the hunters. They hesitated, unable to discern what was happening ahead. The near sight of a fleeing guard, eyes wide with horror, mouth fixed in an echo of the slaves screaming, was enough to turn their blood cold. They hesitated no longer, and glancing at one another in alarm at the sight of their fleeing protectors, took to their heels also. Ere long, weighed down by heavy armor, one after another, they stopped to discard the metal plate, bracers, and elms, cursing the servants who would not halt long enough to aid them. No one knew whether they were still being pursued, but it would not be prudent to linger and find out. There was only one goal in mind: exit the infernal forest and find safety in Grail. Only later would follow the recriminations, the necessary persecution of the one allowing this disaster to overtake them. Blood would have to flow to wipe out this insult, this unbelievable risking of life and limb, not to forget the blows to prestige and reputation. Lund sprawled on the ground, his cheek pressed to the naked soil, as if to hear the pulsing of Myral's dark heart. Breathing caused him hurt to such a degree that he imagined his lungs bruised and tender with overwork, his throat raw with the incessant, rapid passing of air. Against his ribs, the crazed drumming of his heart was slowing at last. He remembered little of the pursuit. His sword arm ached, and lacerations covered his arms and legs. How many had fallen to him during the cowardly flight? He did not know or care. The heady taste of vengeance had overcome reason and calculation, sending him on the blood-crazed rush that had only ceased with the collapse of his body. His need for retribution had ever far surpassed the limited abilities of his frame. Quiet had returned to the wood. There were even bird calls resounding among the trees. Time passed, but he did not stir. A strange feeling stole over him, and he did not resist. The sensation of his heavy, throbbing body grew more and more distant, till it seemed possible he could leave the empty shell behind entirely. His thoughts wandered to Kor. Was this how it felt to move about outside the confines of the flesh? Perhaps not, for he was less and less aware of the pain and purpose of Lund, the Vran runner, starving and worn, and more simply a dry leaf, waiting for the breath of wind to carry him far away. There were noises behind him. Others intruded in his reverie. Voices broke the fragile calm, and a questing thought reached for his detached mind. He sat up slowly, dispersing the fanciful notions like so many drops of water. Breath appeared, relief flooding his face when he saw Lund stir. More youths limped through the trees, all wearing the guardedly jubilant look of an unexpected triumph. He flashed Ceridwen's smile at them. Here and there it was returned, and if the grinning was somewhat crooked, he remembered that it was inspired by bloodletting, and not the soft sunlight playing among the cotton trees. A cloud of gloom seemed to have settled over Grail. Dejection and shame made their way through the cobbled alleys to enter lodgings secure enough to lock fear outside. As the cold evening breeze swirled round corners and rattled the shutters, vengeful talk multiplied against the wretched slaves, the curse of ill luck, and the master of Grail who had brought them together. Chief Overseer Groth moved from tavern to inn, coaxing and listening, all sympathetic and supportive, till he had gathered sufficient intelligence to make a meaningful report to his master. He made his way into the deeper crypts of the citadel, where Lord Zabran had taken up residence since the uprising almost 2 seasons before. The initial distrust and slight animosity between them had all but disappeared since that unfortunate incident with the slaves. They had both been cast in a bad light by the early successes of the Viran. No amount of explanation could re-establish their reputation. They had failed, and had had to be rescued. They had not perceived or anticipated such levels of cunning and resistance among the slaves. Both were blamed, both disgraced. Now they were faced with another potential disaster, and were forced into a deeper alliance still. The Master of Grail drummed impatiently with his fingers, while Groth filled him in on the talk and baleful mood in the town. He had expected no less since the ignominious return of the hunting parties that afternoon. Yet the confirmation of his suspicions was irksome. The longer Groth's voice detailed the ill tidings, the more Zabran's mood turned sour. Groth took no notice of his master's display of irritation, and drew his report to a grim conclusion.
The beaters will not go out tomorrow. I think they prefer the lash to the terrors of the forest. Most of the guards also will not protect the cowardly royals in the hunting grounds any longer. Despite their big talk, I doubt whether any of the lords still desire to venture out either. Some are convinced they are dealing with demons.
He chuckled.
And suspect you of foul play.
Zabran did not join in the show of mirth that followed. The lines round his mouth, already set in a pattern of distaste, deepened. He despised the high lords of the Torque more than mere words could express. A simple accident of birth brought them opportunity he had to earn through trials and back-breaking effort. Their folly would stand against his merits in any matter of importance, and he could do little about it. Moreover, the Great One was not known for tolerating setbacks or listening to excuses, however valid. More dark times lurked just ahead. Certainly, the whole Grail conception was cursed and tainted, and now he had been infected with it. He spoke tersely.
There is but one course of action that remains. We will call off the hunt. Tomorrow we send in the warriors to destroy every last slave still roaming the hunting grounds. When Lord Horan arrives, The matter has to have been concluded.
They lay in a half-circle of companionable comfort, comrades in misery, in starvation and fatigue. For most of them it was undoubtedly the best night of their short lives. They had seen the terrible monsters beaten and humiliated, fleeing from them in panic. And they had followed exultantly, unbelievingly, till they no longer had strength to do so. The cold touch of evening, the weakness of hunger, even the potent threat of a violent dawn, could not rob them of the sweet satisfaction, yet clothing each recumbent form. Lund was grateful for these moments of tranquility, during which he could savor their short-lived victory. They deserved it, these 35 survivors. They had conquered fear and oppression of the mind, had found a worthy place to die. There was nothing shameful about their sordid destiny anymore, since they had refused to remain animals, and had stood up against their masters as equals, to destroy them as equals, and to be crushed by them as equals. Tomorrow the warriors would come, admitting that the Vran slaves were runners no more, but fighters also. They would die the death of men, and not dogs. He knew what to expect. There would be anger, and a thirst for vengeance, the state of mind that could well afford the victim a quick, clean death. There would be no trophies for the hunter, no boast, no gloating. He had half a mind to march up to the gates of Grail itself with his little band. Would that not be a sight for the Torque masters to remember? Yet a suggestion lingered that he had not yet done with dismaying the oppressor, that the morrow might bring further opportunity to harass and frustrate a hasty and overconfident foe. The day passed in a dream. Early on there were still the will and strength to resist. A scouting party was surprised and netted, easy prey for the quick-moving slaves. Yet the pursuit was relentless and tiring, draining what remained of their endurance, and several runners were lost before they managed to slip away. Kor came to the rescue on many occasions, leading them from one hiding place to another. By the afternoon watch they were too fatigued even to pick off an enemy straggler or scout separated from the main body. The slaves stayed in hiding, hoping fervently for the dark and the brief respite offered by the night. The warriors did not return to Grail for the night, but camped in the forest. They lit huge fires, and settled down to their food and comforts, with great noise and demonstration. Lund knew it was meant to intimidate and dishearten the slaves. He suggested a raid during the night, but none of the Vran would follow him now. They needed the rest more than the enemy did. It was Brith who pointed out the obvious truth they had somehow overlooked. He wondered out loud why they could not make for the line and attempt to break out. Heads lifted everywhere at this. Tired bodies stirred in the dark. There was a sudden, painful rebirth of hope, and the possibility of survival. A last effort could be made. They stumbled through the night, ever eastward, the weaker gradually falling behind, Kor watching for signs of pursuit. Lund moved with urgency, but without the accustomed, terrible fear a flight from the masters engendered. He wondered whether he had finally left it behind, whether he had shaken loose of its chains at last. Perhaps he was simply too tired to care any more, for the fatigue in mind and body now was not the type that overwhelmed one at the end of a day of torment and exertion. Then there was always a resistance from within, energy enough to prompt restoration. He knew that no such reserves remained, and the damage done could not be repaired. The slow pace and frequent stops for rest did not aid their attempt. Long before dawn, Lund found himself alone, doggedly working his way through the foliage. His body moved inexorably towards the line, where he would halt, assess the situation, and wait for the others. But his mind was far away, filled with sunlight among the cotton trees, with the strange laughter of his companion, with the indomitable spirit of his kin. Where would she be now? Had she had her wish granted to hide in the cask all the way up the northern road? Had she found the help he had been intended to? Was she on her way with many warriors to end the oppression? He smiled to himself. What fancies assailed the tired mind? Yet he would not check them. The memory of her laughter was like the trickling of a stream, filling the cracks in his dried-up resolve. Lund was at the end of his endurance. The tree behind his seated form felt frail and insubstantial. He stared at his intertwined fingers, pressed between his knees, and tried to remember what to do. Brith. He had to find him. But it was difficult to formulate a clear thought. Would there even be a response? He had little idea how far it still was to the line. The morning sun was gaining in strength, urging him to move on, but he would wait here till others arrived. Time passed, and the weariness engulfed his senses. He started awake at an imagined shout, fearful but distant. He stirred awkwardly into a crouch. There was the shout again, not a scream as much as a call, apprehensive yet commanding. He was puzzled by it. If their pursuers had caught up with them, there would only be the cries of anger and death to be heard. Kor's voice brushed his confusion aside.
Give it up. They're almost upon you. Go with them. You are the last.
Was he dreaming? Would they spare his life? There was no reason for that. The old man's thoughts pushed at him, forcing his mind to wakefulness.
He has come to Grail. I can feel his anger even down here in my prison.
Lund hesitated. Did he understand correctly? Had Kor been taken?
You are also a prisoner, then?
Aren't we all? There is no escape for me, but there may be for you, if you go with them now.
Why would they not simply destroy me?
They will bring you before him first, the Lord of all the Torque. He is a darkness and a threat without measure, beside which the Destroyer is a silly child. It has been many cycles since I have sensed him here, Horan, the Undying.
At the mere touch of this last thought, Lund recoiled as from the snapping fangs of a viper. A name not whispered or translated into conscious thinking, the end of every nightmare, an inescapable horror reaching from beyond the grave, souls tormented and consumed, bound in another's hate, to fuel the warped power that would subvert the very laws of life.
Why would I not die here in peace, but put myself in the hands of such a demon?
He will not know you. I will give you what remains of my strength, so that he may not reach into your mind. They will cast you with all those who remain to the rollings in the lower feeding pits. All the Vran still alive in this realm will perish, unless you find the strength to aid them.